The air inside the courtroom was tense, the kind of tension that clings to your skin, making every breath feel heavier. Spectators filled the gallery, reporters clutching their notepads and cameras rolling. All eyes locked on one man, Victor Grant. Victor sat at the defense table, legs crossed, his polished shoes gleaming under the lights. His expensive suit fit him like armor, dark, sleek, and powerful. But it wasn't just the suit or his wealth that filled the room with unease. It was his smirk. A smug, unwavering smirk that said he believed this courtroom, like everything else in his life, was his to control. At the front of the room, Judge Elena Brooks sat calmly at the bench. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence was undeniable. Elena had spent years earning her place on the bench. She wasn't just a judge. She was a symbol of integrity in a system too often tainted by corruption. Today, she wasn't just presiding over a trial. She was facing off against a man who believed he was above the law. The tension snapped as the bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." Everyone stood, everyone except Victor Grant. The room froze. Judge Brooks's sharp gaze landed on him. "Mr. Grant, I suggest you stand. Now." Her voice was calm but firm, the kind that cuts through noise like a knife. Victor chuckled under his breath, leaning back in his chair as if this was all a joke. "Not today," he said casually. "Not for you." Gasps rippled through the room. Even Victor's own lawyers shifted uneasily in their seats. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail of Victor's smug grin. Judge Brooks didn't flinch. Instead, she reached for her gavel and brought it down. Bam! The sharp crack silencing the whispers in an instant. "Mr. Grant, I'll remind you that in my courtroom, everyone stands when the judge enters." "Bailiff, remove Mr. Grant." The smirk on Victor's face vanished. "You can't do that," he scoffed. "I haven't done anything wrong." "You've shown contempt for this court," Elena shot back. "You'll watch the rest of these proceedings from a holding cell." Victor shot up from his chair, slamming his fist on the table. "I dare you to touch me." The two uniformed officers flanking him didn't hesitate. One grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back with practiced ease, while the other forced him forward. The mighty Victor Grant, a billionaire who once controlled politicians, markets, and media, was now being dragged out of the courtroom like a common criminal. "You'll regret this," Victor shouted over his shoulder. "This isn't over." Judge Brooks leaned back in her chair, unmoved. "We'll see." Her voice was calm, but her eyes were steel. The courtroom erupted in whispers, reporters scribbling furiously, cameras clicking nonstop. The world had just seen something unprecedented. A man who once believed he controlled everything now powerless, before a judge who refused to bend. But even as Victor's furious voice faded down the hall, Elena knew this was far from over. Men like Victor Grant didn't accept defeat quietly, and she had just painted a target on her back. Victor Grant wasn't always the disgraced man being dragged out of a courtroom. For decades, he had been a towering figure, a man whose name alone could shake Wall Street and influence elections. To the public, Victor Grant was a self-made billionaire, the ultimate success story. But behind the carefully crafted image lay a man who built his empire through corruption, manipulation, and ruthless ambition. Victor's rise to power began in the late 1980s. He was young, charismatic, and dangerous in his brilliance. While others played by the rules, Victor rewrote them. His company, Grant Global Holdings, started as a small investment firm but quickly became a juggernaut. He didn't just predict trends in the market, he created them. Stocks soared or plummeted based on his whispers, and investors followed his every move like disciples clinging to a prophet. But Victor didn't stop at financial markets. He knew that true power wasn't just about money, it was about control. Using backdoor deals and quiet bribes, Victor forged ties with politicians, media giants, and global business leaders. If a bill threatened one of his companies, a timely campaign contribution ensured it never passed. If a competitor became too successful, Victor would orchestrate a smear campaign so brutal that their career would collapse overnight. He mastered the art of building loyalty, not through respect, but through fear. CEOs, mayors, and even senators owed him favors, and those who refused quickly regretted it. Rumors spread of Victor's involvement in everything from insider trading to blackmail. Yet no evidence ever surfaced. Witnesses recanted. Evidence vanished. Prosecutors resigned abruptly, often taking lucrative positions in firms connected to Victor. He wasn't just feared, he was untouchable. But Victor's power wasn't all whispers in dark rooms. He flaunted his success with pride. His sprawling mansion in the Hamptons was the stuff of legend, with marble floors imported from Italy and priceless art pieces that even museums envied. He owned a fleet of luxury cars, a 200-foot yacht named Dominion, and a private jet equipped with a gold-plated interior. To Victor, these weren't just luxuries, they were declarations of dominance. His social circle was just as exclusive. Hollywood elites, sports stars, and even heads of state attended Victor's infamous parties, events so extravagant they became tabloid headlines for weeks. But beneath the glamour, Victor never let anyone get too close. He trusted no one. His inner circle consisted only of those who feared him enough to obey without question. Yet, for all his wealth and power, Victor had one fatal flaw: arrogance. He believed he was invincible, that no law, no person, no judge could ever bring him down. And for years, that belief seemed justified. The first real cracks in Victor's empire appeared when rumors of corporate fraud began circulating. A whistleblower from one of his subsidiary firms claimed Grant Global Holdings had manipulated financial statements, inflating profits to attract investors. Victor laughed off the allegations, calling them baseless gossip orchestrated by jealous competitors. But this time, the accusations didn't disappear. Federal investigators quietly launched an inquiry, and what they found was staggering. The deeper they dug, the clearer Victor's trail of corruption became. Offshore accounts hidden under false identities. Real estate purchased with laundered funds. Entire companies created solely to funnel dirty money through a maze of transactions. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking. Billions of dollars tied to fraud, bribery, and extortion. Even still, Victor remained confident. When agents raided his New York penthouse, he barely reacted. He greeted the FBI with a glass of aged scotch in hand and a smug grin on his face. As they handcuffed him and led him down the steps, he muttered to a nearby reporter, "This is nothing. I'll be home by dinner." But Victor had underestimated one thing: Judge Elena Brooks. Elena wasn't like the others Victor had encountered. She couldn't be intimidated or bribed. She didn't play games, and she had made her reputation by taking down powerful men just like him. Her courtroom was her battlefield, and she never backed down from a fight. Victor, however, refused to believe he could lose. He leaned on his connections, expecting powerful friends to make his problems disappear like they always had. But this time, no one answered his calls. As the investigation widened, Victor's allies abandoned him one by one. Politicians distanced themselves. Investors fled. His closest confidants refused to take his meetings. The empire Victor had spent a lifetime building was collapsing, and fast. Desperate, Victor turned to the one tool he still believed he could control: the media. He paid for stories to run on major networks, painting himself as a victim of political persecution, a successful businessman being targeted by jealous rivals. He pushed articles that questioned Judge Brooks' credibility, planting rumors that her decisions were biased and politically motivated. But Victor underestimated Elena's resolve. She didn't just endure the media firestorm, she fought back. With the same calm determination she carried into her courtroom, Elena stayed focused on the facts. Every lie Victor fed the media was countered by hard evidence. Financial records, emails, wire transfers, each one damning, each one impossible to deny. As the trial date approached, Victor's arrogance turned to rage. He believed himself above the law, and yet here he was, facing a judge who refused to bow to him. For the first time in his life, Victor Grant was losing, and he wasn't going to go down quietly. Sitting in his private holding cell, Victor clenched his fists, staring at the wall. He wasn't just angry, he was vengeful. He believed Elena Brooks had humiliated him, and in his mind, that wasn't something he could allow. If she wants a war, Victor muttered to himself, I'll give her one. And Victor Grant wasn't just planning to win in court, he was planning to destroy her life. Judge Elena Brooks had faced pressure before. Years spent holding corrupt businessmen and crooked politicians accountable had prepared her for the weight of public scrutiny. She was no stranger to whispers in the courthouse hallways, or slanted media stories. But this, what Victor Grant was doing, was something far more dangerous. It started quietly. A few murmurs in the press questioning her record. Headlines that seemed harmless at first. Judge Brooks's harsh rulings raise eyebrows, or is Elena Brooks too tough on corporate America? But Elena knew better. These weren't random stories, they were calculated. The articles were carefully worded, subtle enough to plant seeds of doubt without directly attacking her. She recognized Victor's fingerprints all over them. Then came the more personal hits. Reporters showed up at her childhood home in Ohio, questioning her elderly mother about her past. A gossip column claimed Elena's father had once been charged with tax fraud, a half-truth deliberately twisted to smear her family name. The headlines escalated. One outlet accused Elena of having ties to radical political groups. Another claimed she had once accepted bribes, a baseless lie, but one that grabbed headlines nonetheless. Every morning brought a new wave of slander, each one chipping away at her reputation. Victor's strategy was clear. He wanted to undermine Elena's credibility. He knew if he couldn't control her in the courtroom, he could control the way the public saw her. If he could turn her into a villain, his own crimes would look smaller by comparison. But Elena refused to back down. She had built her career on integrity, and no amount of mudslinging was going to change that. Then, the threats began. At first, they seemed harmless, anonymous letters mailed to her courthouse office. They were vague. Nothing more than scribbled warnings to watch her back, or step away while you can. Elena dismissed them as cowardly attempts to intimidate her. She refused to be rattled. But the threats didn't stop. One morning, Elena returned home from court to find her front door scratched, deep gouges carved into the wood. The word traitor had been slashed across the door in crude, jagged letters. The police dismissed it as vandalism, but Elena knew better. Days later, her son David, a sophomore at college, called her in a panic. "Mom," his voice trembled, "I think someone's following me." Elena's blood ran cold. David described a black SUV that had been parked outside his dorm for days, following him whenever he left campus. When David confronted the driver, the car sped away. Elena's instincts told her exactly what this was. Victor Grant had taken his intimidation to the next level. But the worst came just a week later. Late one evening, Elena returned home after a grueling day in court. She barely noticed the plain white envelope tucked under her windshield wiper, until she opened it. Inside was a photograph, a photo of David. He was walking home from campus, his backpack slung over his shoulder, unaware that someone had been watching him. On the back of the photo, scrawled in red ink, were 3 chilling words: "Step down now." Elena sat in her driveway for nearly an hour, gripping the photograph in her trembling hands. For the first time since the trial began, she felt the cold weight of fear. This wasn't just about her career anymore, this was about her family. The next morning, Elena met with Detective Marcus Langley, a seasoned officer known for handling high-profile cases. She handed him the photo and waited in silence as he studied it. Langley's face darkened. "This isn't a threat," he muttered. "This is a promise. We both know who's behind this," Elena said. Her voice was steady, but her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Langley nodded grimly. "Victor Grant has people everywhere. He's not dumb enough to leave evidence behind." He paused. "You need to step down from this case." "No." The word escaped Elena's lips before Langley could finish. "I won't let him win. If I step down now, he'll know threats like this work. He'll do it again, to someone else." Langley sighed heavily. "Then you need protection. I'm assigning officers to watch you and your family. You can't face this alone." For the first time, Elena accepted. She knew her pride couldn't outweigh the safety of her son. That evening, 2 officers stationed themselves outside her home. Elena sat at her kitchen table, staring at the photograph of David. She felt the cold burn of anxiety in her chest, but beneath it, something stronger stirred. Rage. Victor Grant thought he could bully her into submission. He thought he could terrify her into stepping down, but he didn't understand who he was dealing with. "Let him come," Elena whispered to herself. "I'm not going anywhere." The next morning, as Elena walked into her courtroom, she noticed the reporters crowding the steps, waiting for her, their microphones and cameras ready. Victor Grant had declared war. But Elena Brooks was prepared to fight. Victor Grant thought he had won. His smear campaign had spread like wildfire, and the damage seemed irreversible. News anchors debated Judge Elena Brooks's bias as if it were fact. and social media swarmed with theories questioning her integrity. The photo of her son, that chilling warning, still haunted her, but Elena refused to let Victor win. She knew the only way to fight back was to take control of the narrative. And so, she called Peter Calhoun. Peter was a veteran investigative journalist, one of the few in the business who couldn't be bought. He had spent years exposing corruption in politics and corporate America, and more importantly, he had crossed paths with Victor Grant before. Years earlier, Peter had tried to uncover Victor's dirty dealings, but hit a wall when key witnesses mysteriously disappeared, and evidence went missing. Now, with Elena's case front and center, Peter knew this was his chance to finish what he had started. They met late that evening at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. Peter, a grizzled man in his 60s, slid into the booth across from Elena, his notebook already open. "I know what Grant's capable of," Peter said, "but if you're serious about this, we're going to need proof, hard proof." Elena didn't hesitate. "I have files," she said firmly. "Documents, records, everything the prosecution has gathered so far." Peter's eyebrows rose. "That's a good start. But if we're going to expose Victor Grant to the public, we need more than numbers on a page. We need people willing to talk." That's when Elena remembered someone. Henry Caldwell, a former executive at Grant Global Holdings who had mysteriously resigned 2 years earlier. Rumor had it that Henry knew the truth about Victor's fraudulent practices, and had been silenced. Peter tracked him down 3 days later, living quietly in a small town under a different name. Henry refused to speak at first, terrified of what Victor might do. But when Peter showed him the photograph of David, the warning Elena had received, Henry changed his mind. "He doesn't stop," Henry muttered, his voice trembling. "He ruins lives. He doesn't just threaten, he follows through." Henry handed Peter a flash drive. "Everything's on here," he said. "Emails, bank transfers, offshore accounts, it's all there." That night, Peter called Elena. "We've got him," he said. The next morning, Elena's courtroom filled with reporters, but for once, they weren't there for Victor Grant's side of the story. Instead, Peter's bombshell report had gone live at dawn, and by the time court was in session, the headlines were everywhere. Victor Grant exposed. Secret empire of corruption unveiled. Whistleblower reveals Victor Grant's criminal network. Judge Brooks fights back. The truth behind the smear campaign. Victor Grant's smug confidence evaporated the moment he walked into the courtroom. Gone was the arrogant smirk, replaced by a cold, hard stare. For the first time since the trial began, Victor looked cornered. But Elena knew better than to celebrate too early. Victor wasn't the type to accept defeat. He would strike back, and harder than ever. That evening, Elena returned home to find her security detail on high alert. The officers stationed outside her house were doubled, and Detective Langley himself stood by her door. "We intercepted a threat," Langley said grimly. "Grant's people are furious. They're getting desperate." Inside, Elena sat alone in her kitchen, staring at the photograph of her son, the one Grant's people had left as a warning. Her fear still lingered, but there was something else now. Resolve. Victor had underestimated her. He thought she would fold when the pressure mounted. He thought she would break when her family was threatened. But Victor Grant had made a fatal mistake. He pushed too hard, and now the world knew exactly what kind of man he really was. The next morning, Elena returned to court. Cameras swarmed the steps, shouting questions as she passed. Reporters no longer asked about her bias. Instead, they demanded answers about Grant's financial crimes, his intimidation tactics, and his threats against her family. Inside the courtroom, Victor Grant sat slouched in his chair, his lawyer whispering frantically beside him. But Victor wasn't listening. His eyes never left Elena. She met his stare with unwavering calm. "You tried to scare me," Elena thought. "But all you've done is make me stronger." The bailiff called the courtroom to order. "All rise," he announced. And this time, Victor Grant didn't smirk. He stood. The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that seemed to make the air heavier. Ever since the explosive media reports exposed Victor Grant's corruption, the trial had shifted dramatically. The power Victor once wielded now felt like smoke, slipping between his fingers faster than he could grasp it. His connections, once his greatest strength, were turning their backs on him. His wealth couldn't stop the headlines, and the public now saw him for what he really was. a ruthless manipulator who had spent decades above the law. But Victor Grant wasn't the kind of man to go quietly. It was the morning after Peter Calhoun's latest report had gone live, a damning piece that connected Grant Global Holdings to offshore money laundering operations linked to organized crime. The evidence was overwhelming, and Elena Brooks knew the prosecution was poised to deliver a decisive blow. The trial was moving toward its conclusion, and for Victor, that meant one thing: desperation. Victor arrived in court that morning looking different. His tailored suit still fit perfectly, but his face was drawn and tight. The smug grin he had worn so proudly for weeks was gone. In its place was something colder, something dangerous. Judge Elena Brooks took her seat at the bench, her gaze locked on Victor as he whispered something to his lawyer. The attorney's face went pale, but before he could respond, Victor waved him off. "All rise," the bailiff called. The courtroom stood, even Victor, though he did so with a slow, deliberate movement, his eyes never leaving Elena. "Be seated," Elena said firmly. As the room settled, her gaze swept across the crowded courtroom. Reporters, family members, and members of the public filled every bench. Security had been increased since the threats against her family, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The prosecution rose to present their latest evidence, a series of incriminating bank records that tied Victor directly to shell corporations used to launder money. The evidence was damning, and Elena could see Victor's fingers twitching as the prosecutor spoke. Then it happened. The sharp snap of a chair scraping back. The sudden flash of movement. Victor Grant shot to his feet, his hand pulling something from inside his jacket, a gun. For a split second, no one moved. The entire room seemed frozen in time. "Gun!" a security officer shouted. Chaos erupted. Screams filled the room as people dove for cover. Elena instinctively ducked behind her bench as the deafening crack of a gunshot echoed through the courtroom. Bang! The bullet shattered the wood railing just feet away from where Elena had been sitting. Splinters flew across her bench as officers lunged toward Victor. "Stay down!" Detective Langley's voice barked above the chaos as he rushed forward, his firearm drawn. Victor fired again, wild and unfocused, this time hitting a wall near the jury box. Papers scattered as people scrambled for safety. "Drop the gun!" Langley roared, closing in fast. But Victor wasn't backing down. His face twisted in rage, his eyes wild and burning with fury. His empire was collapsing, and now he was determined to take down the one person who refused to bend, Judge Elena Brooks. "You think you've won?" Victor bellowed, pointing the gun toward Elena's bench. "You think you can ruin me?" "Victor, stop," his attorney shouted, his voice desperate. "You're only making it worse." But Victor didn't care. He raised the gun again, his hand shaking violently. And then, bang! The sound of another shot echoed through the room. Victor staggered back, his face frozen in shock. Blood seeped through his tailored suit as his arm went limp. The gun clattered to the floor, spinning away from his fingers. Langley stood just feet away, his service weapon still raised. "Suspect down," he barked, signaling his officers forward. Victor Grant collapsed into a heap on the floor, clutching his side. The courtroom remained silent, save for the distant sound of sirens approaching. Elena slowly rose from behind her bench, her breath shaking. She looked down at Victor, who lay sprawled on the ground, gasping for breath. His once proud arrogance had vanished, replaced by a twisted grimace of pain and rage. You think this is over?" Victor hissed, his voice faint. "You're just like the rest, you'll lose. Just like they did." Elena stared at him for a long moment, her voice cold and unwavering. "No, Victor," she said firmly. "This time, you lost." Paramedics rushed in moments later, loading Victor onto a stretcher. As he was wheeled away, his eyes locked on Elena one final time, a look filled with hatred and defeat. Langley approached her, lowering his weapon. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softer now. Elena exhaled slowly, still feeling her heart pounding in her chest. "Yeah," she said. "But something tells me this isn't over yet." Langley nodded grimly. "Men like Grant, they never stop fighting." "Let him try," Elena said, her voice steeled with resolve. "I'm not backing down." The courtroom slowly began to return to order, stunned reporters gathering their notes, whispering hurriedly into their microphones. Elena sat back in her chair, her fingers tightening around her gavel. Victor Grant had tried to intimidate her, humiliate her, and now, kill her. But none of it worked. He underestimated one thing. Judge Elena Brooks wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for justice. And justice wasn't finished yet. The morning after the courtroom shooting, Judge Elena Brooks sat in her office, staring at the cracked wood panel on her bench, the spot where Victor Grant's bullet had splintered the wood just inches from her head. The reminder of how close she had come to death weighed heavy in her mind. Yet, despite the lingering fear, Elena knew she couldn't back down. Victor Grant may have been carried out of the courtroom in handcuffs and a bloodied suit. But Elena knew better than to assume the fight was over. Men like Victor never stopped. They schemed, manipulated, and clawed for power until their dying breath. And Victor wasn't finished yet. A sharp knock at her door broke her thoughts. Detective Langley stepped in, his face grim. "He's out of surgery," Langley said. "Stable, but still dangerous." "Let me guess," Elena replied, her voice tired yet sharp. "Already plotting his next move." Langley's expression hardened. "His lawyers are already filing motions. They're arguing that the shooting was an assassination attempt orchestrated by your courtroom security team. They're painting him as the victim." Elena scoffed in disbelief. "He fired the first shot." Langley shook his head. "Doesn't matter. The media is already running with their version of the story. That Victor Grant was a man unfairly targeted by a corrupt legal system." He sighed. "People love a powerful man playing the victim." Elena clenched her fists, frustration boiling inside her. Victor was manipulating public perception, again. The man had tried to kill her. Yet somehow, he was controlling the narrative from a hospital bed. "I can't let him win," Elena muttered. "Not this time." Langley's eyes narrowed. "Then hit him where it hurts." Elena paused. "What do you mean?" "Victor thrives on power," Langley said. "His money, his connections, his public image, that's what he's protecting. If you want to beat him, you have to rip that away." For a moment, Elena remained silent. Langley was right. Victor's influence had always been his greatest weapon. But if Elena could destroy that, expose him for what he truly was, she could strip him of his greatest advantage. She picked up her phone. "Get me Peter Calhoun," she said. "We're about to turn this war around." Hours later, Elena met Peter Calhoun in a quiet office away from the courthouse. The veteran journalist looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed from weeks of non-stop reporting. "You've been busy," Elena said as she greeted him. Peter chuckled dryly. "So have you." "I need your help," Elena said, getting straight to the point. "Victor's trying to twist what happened in the courtroom. He's playing the victim. And if he succeeds, I won't just lose this case, I'll lose my career." Peter leaned forward. "What do you need?" "I need to expose him," Elena said firmly. "Not just his crimes, his network, his connections, the people protecting him. The world needs to see that Victor Grant isn't a misunderstood businessman. He's a criminal who manipulates power to destroy lives." Peter nodded. "I've been digging," he said. "Victor's got a history of silencing anyone who crosses him. Reporters, business rivals, even politicians. I've got evidence linking him to a series of bribery scandals in Washington. Payments made to push legislation that favored Grant Global Holdings. I just haven't had the right platform to release it." "You have it now," Elena said. "I want everything public, every deal, every cover-up, every crime. The people need to know exactly who Victor Grant really is." Peter's eyes sparked with determination. "Consider it done." The following morning, headlines across the country erupted with new revelations about Victor Grant. News outlets ran special reports detailing his long history of corruption, exposing years of payoffs, threats, and illegal dealings. Leaked documents showed Victor's hidden offshore accounts, connections to organized crime, and his efforts to manipulate the legal system. But what hit hardest was the personal angle, the testimony of former employees who had been threatened into silence, and even a brave confession from Victor's own former accountant, who revealed how Victor funneled millions into secret slush funds. The narrative had shifted. Victor Grant was no longer seen as a powerful businessman fighting injustice. He was a criminal mastermind whose empire had been built on intimidation and corruption. Elena had landed a devastating blow. But Victor wasn't finished yet. Days later, Elena was preparing for court when her clerk, Daniel, rushed into her office, his face pale. "You need to see this," he said breathlessly. He handed her a tablet. On the screen was a live news broadcast. Outside the courthouse, Victor Grant's lawyer, Paul Donovan, was addressing the media. "We now have evidence," Donovan announced, "that Judge Elena Brooks has manipulated this case from the start. Witnesses have come forward claiming she tampered with court records and suppressed evidence that would have cleared Mr. Grant of wrongdoing." Elena's heart stopped. That's a lie," she said quietly. Daniel's voice shook. "They're claiming you faked documents to frame Victor. They're demanding you be removed from the bench." Elena's hand tightened on the desk. Victor had played his final card. A bold, desperate attempt to turn her into the villain. "I'm not backing down," she said firmly. "We fight this in court." The following morning, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, security, and spectators filled every corner. Victor, still recovering from his injury, sat at the defense table, his arm wrapped in a sling. Yet despite his condition, the smug grin had returned to his face. Judge Elena Brooks took her seat, her gaze locking onto Victor. For weeks, he had manipulated the media, twisted the truth, and tried to destroy her. But today, she would end it. "Mr. Donovan," she said sharply, "you've claimed I falsified evidence. Present your proof." Donovan stood slowly. "Your Honor, our witnesses are prepared to testify that." "I don't want hearsay," Elena cut in. "I want proof. Documents, signatures, timestamps. Show me the evidence or drop this charade." Donovan faltered. We're still gathering the necessary files." "You mean you have nothing?" Elena shot back. "Because this is a lie, a desperate attempt by a desperate man." Her voice rose, commanding the courtroom's attention. "Victor Grant has manipulated this case from the start. He's tried to silence witnesses, twist the truth, and even resorted to violence to escape justice. But no more." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. "This trial is not about power or influence. It's about accountability. And no matter how wealthy or powerful Victor Grant may be, he will answer for his crimes." The courtroom fell silent. Victor's smirk vanished. "Now," Elena said, slamming her gavel down, "let's proceed." The war wasn't over yet, but Victor Grant was running out of moves, and Elena Brooks wasn't backing down. The final day of the trial arrived, with an intensity that seemed to electrify the air. The courtroom was packed, reporters lined the back walls, cameras positioned to capture every second. Across the country, Americans tuned in to watch what had become one of the most high-profile trials in recent memory. The question on everyone's mind wasn't just about Victor Grant's guilt. It was whether Judge Elena Brooks would survive the storm he had created. Victor Grant sat at the defense table, dressed in a crisp charcoal suit. His arm was still in a sling from the courtroom shooting, and he played the victim card to perfection, leaning back slightly, face calm but weary, like a man who had suffered enough. His lawyer, Paul Donovan, wore a smug smile, one that suggested he believed victory was inevitable. But across the room, Judge Elena Brooks was ready. She knew this wasn't just a trial, this was a statement. If Victor Grant walked free today, it would send a message that the rich and powerful were above the law. She wouldn't let that happen. The trial resumed with the prosecution's closing argument. David Ramirez